So at 28, I made a decision that frankly cost me hundreds of thousands of pounds. I opted out of my pension. That was pretty stupid. I like to sort of berate myself and thinking I was really reckless with money. And I think I was, but I don't think that's the full story. So basically you blew your money in your 20s and now you want sympathy. I love that. Ouch. My mum, on the other hand, she didn't need to think about it. And I think that's the interesting point and the interesting difference. And I think there's a real gap being experienced between sort of millennials and Gen X, who are too old for decent pensions, like the one my mum had, and too young for auto-enrolment. 35% of people in work are not saving into a pension. 41% of people aged 25 to 54 are not on track for retirement. More worryingly is the average pension pot of those in their late 40s, early 50s is around £27,000, which, you know, you don't have to be great at maths to know that that's massively, massively short of what you may need in later life. Sounds like excuses. You knew what a pension was. Why did you opt out? Thanks, Mum. Hey folks, welcome to It's All Relative with me, Dr. Eliza Philby. Now, I'm looking very red today. I can see that there is red here, red there, and I've also got my branded mug. So this week I wrote an essay on a really unsexy subject, which is pensions. And I wanted to kind of first tell my own story about how I suddenly started taking my pension seriously, because I think it's something, certainly of my generation. Now I'm 44, and I think there is that generation really who are sort of older millennials and younger Gen X, who slightly fall through the gap when it comes to pensions. And I'm going to sort of tell my own story and then tell you why I think it's important. So at 28, I made a decision that frankly cost me hundreds of thousands of pounds. And at the time I didn't really think about it. And it's probably, I did a lot of interesting things in my 20s and wild things in my 20s. This wasn't wild, but the consequences were huge. I opted out of my pension. I know kind of, maybe you're thinking, well, that was pretty stupid. Maybe you're thinking, oh, that's me. Maybe you're thinking, who cares? This is boring. But let me tell you kind of the context, because I think it's quite an interesting tale that reflects a broader story of what's happened to our generation when it comes to pension. I, at the time, was living in London. I had very luckily, very fortunately, was living in my parents' second house. I was earning incredibly little, very much counting every pound, and felt that a pension wasn't really something that I needed to invest in. Thank you very much. I was more interested in having the hard cash than the long-term investments. You know, compound interest was of no interest to me. So, you know, I've never been one of those people that lived by a spreadsheet or counted every penny. I was much more of the view that I was kind of living life. And then after that, I became a freelancer. So I had a number of years in which I was a freelancer. And those freelancer years, doing journalism, running workshops, doing freelance teaching, you know, let's just say they did not pay well, but also they were living, you know, month to month. And I certainly, when kind of understanding financial planning, I was thinking like, can I make it to the end of the month, let alone can I make it to the end of my career and retirement? And there was no promotion, there was no pay rise. If anything, actually, I was working in journalism and there was a massive pay decrease. I remember going from being paid £800 an article to being paid £100 an article. That was the significant drop over the period in which I was being a freelance writer. And there was just certainly no feeling that I should be contributing to a pension. And then after that, I started a business, which, you know, always sounds impressive, right? You're a founder. Yeah, a founder of nothing in the beginning. And at that point, all of the money that I was making, I was putting back into reinvesting into the business, frankly, just to keep it alive. Looking back, in this kind of checkered working history, I like to sort of berate myself and thinking I was really reckless with money. And I think I was, but I don't think that's the full story. I think in my sort of pension journey, as it were, there's also a broader story, which is one that was about my family and how money was talked about and raised and earned and saved in my own family. And there's also a generational point about our own generational experience of pensions. So firstly, I was raised in a family where my dad was quite distrustful of banks. He was also very, he was a son of a gambler, right? So he used to literally hide money under the stairs. And he was, someone that worked his entire life. And when he even was diagnosed with cancer, continued to work and literally worked until he physically couldn't and didn't have a pension. But it was my mum, on the other hand, who worked for the John Lewis Partnership her entire life. Like, she had one of those, what is probably now quite a relic, like a historical relic, because she worked for the same company. She had one job. Had one employer. She had for 40 years, over that time, building into a pension. A very good pension, a very stable pension. But it also didn't require her to do much life admin, right? She just literally saw the money transfer from her employer and herself, her wage, into that pot, and that pot rose. And so it didn't actually require much of her, apart from actually having to obviously work. She didn't need to think about it. And I think that's the interesting point and the interesting difference. And so what my mum had no longer exists. But also what my parents were able to do no longer exists, which is put a lot of their excess capital into property. And I think there's a real gap being experienced between sort of millennials and Gen X, particularly millennials sort of aged sort of around 40, right through to Gen Xers up to sort of 55, who are too old for decent pensions, like the one my mum had, and too young for auto-enrolment. But also in this, they were the generation who were kind of Thatcher's babies and who grew up with quite a sort of, I think, a degree of financial illiteracy. I certainly felt up until relatively recently financially illiterate. But also sort of there was no sort of nudges towards saving. There was no sort of mass educational incentives. There was also, I think, a real credit culture and debt culture. We grew up with payday loans and buy now, pay later, and quite an unregulated loan environment. And also, I think, a total lack of awareness of how those things operated. I think also many of us have had like squiggly careers, as the phrase goes, and perhaps have worked in multiple environments and not always sort of prioritised our pension. And we're now in that squeezed bit of life where potentially we're investing in our kids, maybe looking after elderly parents, obviously at the forefront of the kind of mortgage crisis and, prioritising home ownership, or even just still saving for a deposit. Pension, saving for our retirement is like way down the list of financial priorities. It's all relative. It's the mug. We have branded goods here, and it's reflective of the fact that I have a weekly Substack called It's All Relative out every Friday, and as you can see, we also have a weekly YouTube show out every Wednesday. Please do go over to Substack, subscribe. You'll get everything for free, no paywall, and I'd love it if you could comment, like on any of the posts. So Legal in General have brought out this report which has done a real sort of deep dive into the state of pensions in the UK, and they found that 35% of people in work are not saving into a pension at all. 35%. And with a particular emphasis, the people who are most vulnerable in that cohort are people that are single, tend to have undersaved, people that live in London, actually quite surprisingly, have undersaved for their retirement, people that work in small businesses, like mine, small businesses that are really struggling in terms of how much it now costs to hire people, don't often give their employees a great deal when it comes to pensions. And many of them, as the report suggests, are not even actually adhering to the legal requirements for providing pensions for their workers. And the other group, which is particularly sort of vulnerable is the self-employed. Now, that's probably no surprise to us all there, but I think it's just re-emphasizing that sort of bracket 40 to sort of 55, who perhaps have had a sort of slightly squiggly career and less linear path in work, and may have periods of freelancing or self-employment, have not, have undersaved when it comes to their retirement. So it suggests that 41% of people aged 25 to 54 are not on track for retirement. But I suppose more worryingly is the average pension pot of those in their late 40s, early 50s is around £27,000, which, you don't have to be great at maths to know that that's massively, massively short of what you may need in later life. And 1 in 5 expect their retirement sort of to savings to be inadequate. There's also something here that's just really interesting, is this idea that really vulnerable are the ones that are not homeowners. Now, currently, we associate old age with home ownership, mortgage-free, and the triple lock, and probably a certain degree of affluence, right? Very soon, that story is going to begin to change, because it has been estimated that by 2040, when millennials like us start to retire, 1 in 3 will be renting. 1 in 3. And a number of us actually won't even have finished paying off our mortgage. So this idea that our pension doesn't and won't include housing costs is true now for a lot of pensioners, not all of them, but really won't be true in 20 years' time. So it's actually even more important that we really start thinking about saving for our pension and saving in later life. Going back to me, my own sort of like wake up call on the pensions front didn't come from a financial advisor, didn't come from a YouTube influencer, didn't come from a spreadsheet, but it came from a children's book. Now, when my son was very young, literally a babe in arms, I used to read to him, and there was one particular book called The Ant and the Grasshopper, and I literally, every time I would read this book, my palms would begin to sweat. It's so bizarre what kind of shakes you into action. But it was this one book, and I wasn't reading it to my son, I was reading it to myself, because it's about an ant and a grasshopper. And let me see if I can bastardize this fable here. It's a very famous fable. Is the ant is the sensible one. So in the summertime, the ant is buzzing away, working away, and storing up all the foodstuffs. And the grasshopper is lying back, sunbathing, having a great time. Come winter time, the ant is very, very cozily in his little cave, eating his, saved food, while the grasshopper is outside, freezing, malnourished, and really regretting his life choices. and in the end, wonderful ending. The ant takes the grasshopper in and shares his food. But the message that I got from that book was very much start saving for a pension for the winter years of your life, right? And I think the reason I did get that message from that book is was because I was at a time in my life where I'd just given birth to my son, and I had also unfortunately lost my father. And so I was at this sort of point in my life where there was a really sort of looming sense of time and mortality. And I think it was the first time I was confronted with this idea that time genuinely would run out. I sort of had been this slightly, I suppose, reckless being. I'd always assumed there'd always be more time in my life. And I guess I realised through birth and death that wasn't always going to be the case. And so that really jolted me into action. Now, that was me, right? And I'm not suggesting in any way that you should run away and buy The Ant and the Grasshopper. I think the broader point here is that they're actually not about, pensions are not about money as such. They're more often about time. And if you are in that bracket, sort of 40 to 50, plus, there is still time. And it's sort of that realization that actually you can sort of take action, and that action will result in greater financial security, I think is incredibly empowering at that time of your life. And if you are someone that's slightly buried your head in the sand, or resigned to not engaging with any of this stuff, or feel, I don't know, sweaty palms whenever the idea of pension comes up, you know, actually taking action or seeing how much is in your pot is actually the most liberating and empowering thing you can do. And there is still time. I think pensions have an image problem, right? You may have already switched off from this video. They're not sexy. They're not even like tangible in the same way that a house is. And also at a time of cost of living crisis, and frankly, a series of crises, perma shocks, we want to feel like our cash is accessible potentially, rather than squirreled away and inaccessible to a certain for a certain number of years. I'm not writing this as a kind of financial expert at all. This is not financial advice. I feel like I have to say that again and again and again. But there was a really interesting moment last week. I helped launch the report with Legal & General, and the CEO of Age Concern in the UK, now that's an ageing charity, right? And by the way, he represents anyone over the age of 50. That's when Age Concern, you know, sees old age, which I thought was fascinating and frightening at the same time. But he said something on stage which really has stayed with me, which is, we talk so much these days about preventative health, you know, how your 40s is the moment in your life where you can really help define what your old age looks like. So, you know, a number of us are doing resistance training and maintaining our muscle mass, and maybe quitting all those bad habits that you'd kind of sustained for a bit too long, and realizing that preventative health can be really, in these years, really empowering and really defining and really important decisions. And I think it's the same with wealth. It's the same with your money. The decisions you make now are the decisions that you're going to have to live with in your 70s and potentially 80s. So I'd kind of stress that your 40s and 50s are not the end. They're actually probably the inflection point. I guess the moral of my story is that I didn't really appreciate compound interest when I was 28. I wish there had been auto-enrollment when I was 28. I look upon Gen Z with admiration and amazement, and the way they think about long-term financial health, and educate themselves and think about their investments, and really invest time and energy and effort into financial admin. But I think the point is that if you are in your 40s and 50s, there's still runway, and you can start thinking and getting interested in this stuff in a way that potentially you haven't, or maybe you've avoided. And I just want to say that it's not too late. And I just want to say that there is power in knowledge. And I just want to say that the only way to do that is to get started. And I want to leave you with that before we now move into community questions. My mum hates this book, but I think you'll love it. It's part autobiography, part sort of social analysis of the rising phenomena of the bank of mum and dad. And I pick apart my own dependency on the bank of mum and dad, and also interview loads of other people that have had very different life experiences. Some loads of money from their parents, some none, some charging interest, in all parts of the world in the UK. And it's full of data, it's full of insight, and it's been described as a mashup between Dolly Alderton novel and The Economist. So I kind of feel like, if you haven't heard of it, where have you been? But also, if you haven't bought it, please do. And also, I can recommend the audiobook, which is on Spotify and is narrated by me. And I really enjoyed actually reading the book as much, probably more than I did actually writing it. Inheritocracy, out in paperback and audiobook now. Okay, I genuinely don't know what my pension situation is. And that's incredibly common. I think it's incredibly common, and it's more common this is what the data was revealing for legal in general, that ignorance is more common in people in their 40s and 50s than it is in their 20s and 30s, which is fascinating. But also something that you can definitely kind of say, right, okay, the first point is self-awareness. The second point is action to any problem. Okay, I opted out years ago and now I feel like I've messed everything up. Again, I think and I hope that my honesty around my pensions mess up might inspire others to think and reflect on what they not did but can do. And I think there's so much guilt and shame around money. Certainly, I think maybe some of the legacy of our sort of Judeo-Christian tradition in this country, there's a lot of shame around money. And also it's incredibly emotionally complex issue that quite often goes way back. You know, our attitudes towards finances and money are shaped between the ages of 7 and 12. It's really young. And so to think about how your parents talked about money and what you observed about money from a young age can actually be a really liberating internal conversation. I would recommend anyone to kind of do that, walk through that, because it will help you disassociate from what you think about money to what you can do about your financial situation. Why didn't anyone teach us this in school? I should have been learning about tax and pensions instead of learning about Pythagoras theorem. Well, you know, I mean, Pythagoras theorem is really useful, but yes, I totally take your point. I actually think the idea of financial literacy in schools is gathering momentum now. I think the government is starting to take it seriously. There's lots of financial charities that have been pushing for this for years and years and years. I think, though, that actually I don't want to put the responsibility of financial education on teachers. Like, I feel like that's too... I mean, they've got enough to be doing. Do you know what I mean? Like, and also, I know a lot of teachers I know would don't feel financially literate themselves. So I feel like that's slightly unfair to load them with that burden. However, I do think that one of the definite things, the transitions we saw in the 80s, 90s and noughties was this transition of the employer and to a certain extent the state being in charge of long-term financial security, to the onus and the responsibility being on the individual. And I think Gen Z, you can see, are definitely take that much more seriously, that responsibility. You know, some, not all, obviously, but certainly millennials and Gen X are that generation that fall through the gap of that evolution of onus on the individual. And I think the point is it's not too late to sort of self-educate and take action. Okay, I'm paying in, but I don't think it will be enough anyway. I mean, what is enough? I think I wrote a piece in the Times about this a couple of weeks ago, which is what you're seeing now is people's pension being used for their grandkids to go to university or to support their, even their parents through giving them weekly care. Weekly home care, or pensions being used for to help your children with their mortgage. So I think we're moving into a society where increasing economic volatility means that the family unit, the 3-generation, not 2-generation, not the nuclear family, but the multi-generational family unit, is the point of financial stability, and that pot within the family is shared and changes shape. And becomes interdependent in a way that a pension is therefore not just for you, but for multiple generations. Now, that's why single people are uniquely disadvantaged because they don't have the security, that intergenerational financial security. And I'm not talking about the inequality of the bank of mum and dad here. I'm talking about the most financially resilient people right now are the ones that have multiple generations to help with care costs, to help with housing costs, to help with education costs, and to help with shoulder economic shocks. So basically you blew your money in your 20s and now you want sympathy. I love that. Ouch. No, I'm explaining why millions of people make really human decisions that in the long term are potentially not always the right ones. But I love your boldness. Okay, Damla, why are you giving me all these rude ones? This is just bad discipline. Plenty of people managed it. Yes, but not everyone is spreadsheet Joe. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know loads of people who are just like obsessed with, and they're really impressive. And I'm always sort of envious and slightly intimidated by them, who can count every penny, invest every penny, and just, just are wholly focused on retiring at 55. But that's not, as this data suggests, most people. Not everyone has that discipline. And not everyone was shown that discipline, or not everyone wants that discipline as well. Okay, why should I care if people didn't plan ahead? Because the consequences don't just become individual, they become societal. And I think, for example, in 20 years' time, when 1 in 3 pensioners are renting, there is going to be a very different political landscape as a result. Right now, the priority is on inheritance tax and allowing people to preserve the family home, for example. That may not be the case if in 20 years' time there is no family home because pensioners are renting and not owning. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though.
I have a question.
Go on.
Yeah, it's not a rude one.
Okay.
You see, the turning point. You see how yours was the book?
Yes.
Mine was when I started thinking about kids.
Yeah.
And just starting to become more responsible.
Mm.
And then I started checking out all the places I've worked in the past and tried to find where all these little pension pots are.
Yes.
So it's kind of like just a difference in terms of what motivates people to start thinking about a pension. For me,
I think it's kids. I think that's interesting because I think it is kids. Quite often, kids make you grow up, right? But because people are having kids later, they are financially growing up later, but they're also buying a house later. So all of these things collide at once and concertinaed into a really short point of your life, and where you're going, should I save for a house? Should I buy a house? Should I rearrange my mortgage, or is it all going in the pension? Oh no, hang on, I'll set up a pension for my kids. So many friends I know who have kids, their kids have more in the savings pot than the parents have in the savings pot. Their kids are richer than them. And whilst that makes total sense in an inheritocracy, it's also sort of slightly selfless and potentially storing up problems for later life. But I think you're right. I think kids is the turning point. Kids was the turning point for me to also, I mean, I remember so distinctly being in that hospital and going, fucking grow up now. Holding the baby, not being able to breastfeed, and going, get me out of here. I've got shit to do. And shit to do meant essentially sort my life out.
No, it really does, yeah.
And I think the focusing of the mind when you have kids. But I think I think it is having kids. But that's not everyone either. And if we're talking about single people being the most vulnerable, single child-free people, actually quite often child-free women in particular, have the most disposable income. So anyway, okay. So, sounds like excuses. You knew what a pension was. Why did you opt out? Thanks, Mum. Okay, what does this mean for me? If you're in your 20s right now, you are definitely, you have the gift of time. You'll probably be more financially aware than I was, certainly. You're on an auto-enrollment scheme. I would, I think there's definitely really positive indications that self-enrollment has actually changed the game for your generation. But you're also fighting another pressure which we don't have, which is student loans. So I feel like, 6 of one, half dozen the other, to be honest. If you're in your 30s and you may be thinking of having kids or do have kids already, I think one of the things that I think is really interesting is maternity leave, and just thinking about what your pension looks like during maternity leave. I was freelance during my maternity leave, and I think I got £6 a week from the government. You are also entering the most expensive years, and pensions can feel really abstract. And I think just again, it's that piece of, if you can do something, do it, because time is definitely still on your side. And really, I'm talking to those in their 40s and 50s here. You know, I understand the squeeze you're in. I understand that squeeze is economic, but also potentially familial. But it's not the end. It's the inflection point, and you can be the ant, even if you've, in the past, been the grasshopper. And if you're in your 60s, and still sort of, you know, I have a friend who's just turned 60 and he's renting, and his landlord's increased his rent by over £200 a month, and he's now working 6 days a week and doesn't expect to ever retire. And it's so difficult to in that situation, and I'm not going to pretend to know what to do in that situation, by the way. Pensioner poverty is still alive and is only going to increase, and I think we have to really kind of have a wake-up call as a country, and this is very UK specific, right, in this in context, is what can we as a country afford, and what is it that we as a country can provide, and what is it that individuals can do, but also employers. One of the really frightening data points in this work from L&G is the number of people that said that their employer wasn't providing them with a pension, and so the onus there has to be on the employer. So I don't want to leave on a depressing note. I think there's nothing sexy about pensions, I think, but also there's also nothing more empowering than getting a sense of what your options are, what your pots are, and educating yourself on this. I think actually that is quite sexy. I think that is empowering. It is bringing a sense of calm and control over something that maybe was giving you sweaty palms and giving you a sort of nervous sense of uncertainty. And I think in this time of uncertainty, anything we can do to make us feel less anxious around money and gives us a greater sense of stability, I think we should definitely take time to do. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, do please subscribe on YouTube. And to all my followers and listeners on Spotify, please do subscribe. It means you will not miss an episode and stay up to date with all of our content. Thanks for watching.